everyone. This is Miss, and this is coming up with a confidence interval for project. Specifically, this was in our notes for section 6.3. This was example 4. We did the other examples in class, but I wanted to make sure you all had this one worked out as well. So we're told in the example that a random sample of 1,123 prospective homebuyers in the Southeast United States were asked if they would go over their budget for the perfect house. The following Pareto chart displays the results of this survey. And so we have qualitative data, right? The data that would be collected, either yes, they would, no, they would not, or they're not sure. And we have percentages instead of proportions, but that's fine. We technically have 3 different outcomes. And remember that when we're dealing with proportions, specifically confidence intervals for proportions, and anytime we were dealing with the binomial setting, we had to only have 2 outcomes. And so right now we have 3, but later when we get to part C, we're specifically asked to construct a confidence interval for those who say they would go over their budget. That then becomes our sample proportion. So p hat, and I'm going to go ahead and write it as a decimal instead of a percentage. And in this case, it looks like there's been some rounding that made this not actually add up to 100%. But technically, the rest of the responses, which if we think of q hat as 1 minus, then that would be 1 minus 0.6 or 0.360. And if we were to add this 0.2 for 9 plus 0.11, of course, would give us 0.359. So it's just off, where probably there's a lower number, the number next to the 0 didn't round it up. Maybe the number next to this line left it a 9, and then this 0.0 didn't get rounded up. It's okay as long as it's very, very, it's only off by whatever our furthest decimal place is. We're not going to be too concerned. However, if we were actually trying to identify our sample proportion of successes and our sample proportion of failures, we would want to use the 2 numbers that would add up to 1. So, all right, so we have this information. The first thing we need to do is identify the population. We're told that we have a sample of 1,123 prospective homebuyers. So this sample had to come from our total population. So in this case, if I go past that number and I start reading, we have prospective homebuyers in the Southeast United States. That is my population that I'm concerned with. So not just prospective homebuyers, or not all homebuyers. It is going to be all prospective buyers in this region in the Southeast United States. So not just all prospective homebuyers, not all people in the Southeast United States region. Our population is very specific. We'll actually end up using this in our interpretation of our confidence interval. So that's where we want to be able to identify the population. Of course, we have, that would be our population. I'm going to go ahead, our sample, our total sample size, is 1,100. We'll use that here in just a minute. In fact, for this next question, how many home buyers said that they would go over their budget for the perfect house? So how many, that's going to be a number, not a percentage or a proportion. And we've talked about being able to find a proportion by dividing the number of successes, which we've been using an X to represent that, by the number in our sample, N. So far, we've had the X and the N to find P hat. Well, since I know that my P hat is 0.640, I'm looking for that, and my sample size is 1123. I can set up this same formula function, put the numbers in that I know, the P hat and the N in this case, instead of the X and the N. Or, if you remember from chapter 2, when we were talking about pie charts and whatnot, when we were trying to find a percentage of a group, we said we could just multiply. So if I want to know 64% of this sample of 1,123 prospective home buyers, that's going to be the number who gave that response. Now, in this case, we actually we don't get a nice whole number. When I use calculator, you can use, if you've got a handheld calculator for the test, welcome to bring it, or you can use the Desmos calculator or the Google calculator. So when I calculate, I get that X is 718.72. But of course, when I'm talking about how many home buyers, I'm talking about counting things. And remember, when we're counting things, if we have discrete data, our data has to be a whole number. So we have to, in this case, we would round up. So 719 prospective home buyers. And I'm actually going to abbreviate even more. I'm just going to say SE for Southeast. So now I have my X, I have my N. Those are two things that we'll need in order to use StatCrunch and come up with our confidence interval. The other thing that we need is to know what our confidence level is. And so I like to go ahead and, even if I've been down other places, I like everything just in one nice little list. So I know that X is 719, N is 1123, and C, which is my confidence level, is 0.99. Remember, you do need to put in as a decimal. However, I've never seen the confidence interval written as a decimal. It's always written as a percent. But when we use the number, we have to change it to a decimal. All right, so unfortunately, with this document camera, I can't show you my screen and my paper at the same time. But I've printed off this handy blank screen of what it would look like if we went into StatCrunch. So of course, in StatCrunch, get to this window, you're going to go to Stat, and then remember, we are using proportion stats. When we were doing confidence intervals for a mean, we were using these stats. For either, we're only going to be looking at one sample. And then for proportions, we're only going to have the summary. So you're not going to have any questions that give you a list of, 1,123 word responses where, 719 of them of the rows say would go over budget, and then the rest, they have these actual words. That would be with data. We don't have data. We're going to have a summary, and that summary is going to need exactly those three numbers. So the X and the N, those are our summary values. And then we do want to make sure that we switch it to confidence interval instead of hypothesis test. That's chapter 7. We're not there yet. And then typically this is a 0.95 as a default. So I went ahead and deleted it before I printed so that I could write in that 0.99. Of course, 7, 19, and 11, 23. So once you have those three numbers, that's all you got to do. Number, number, select, and then number. You can click compute. And I went ahead, again, because you can't see my screen, went ahead and printed out what StatCrunch will give us once we do that. And so it reminds us of what confidence level we use, 99% confidence interval. That way, if you forget to change that default of 0.95, if you check right there, should match up with what you're trying to, what you're being asked to find. It'll let you know the parameter, in this case P for proportion. Then it just gives us our X, our N, this is P hat. The standard error is actually a different calculation. I'm not really worried about you knowing the calculation. The main thing I want you to know is that this is not the margin of error. So we've been using a capital E for that. This is not this. The standard error, that would be how the standard deviation of the sampling distribution of sample proportions would be calculated. That would be the standard error. But we're not doing that. We're not looking for that. We're not calculating that. I just don't want you to end up using that number as the margin of error. And then we've got the two numbers that we really want for our confidence interval, and that is our lower limit and our upper limit. So this one doesn't actually say, like some of our other ones did, it doesn't say to write the confidence interval in all three formats that we've done. But let's go ahead and do that. So our interval notation, that's when we use our parentheses and just put our numbers in. I'm going to round to 3 decimal places since that's what our sample proportion that we were given was rounded to. So I'm going to say that my lower limit is 0.603. And then my upper limit of that confidence is 6.677. And then I use those same exact numbers in a slightly different notation to say that P, not P hat, that P, the population proportion, is somewhere between this lower bound and upper bound, the 603 and 677. So this was what we call interval notation. This is what we call symbolic notation. And then remember, the third format is what I call the plus minus notation. And essentially that's our point estimate, and then plus or minus the margin of error, that E. So the easiest way to figure out, especially when you have the upper and lower limits and the sample proportion from StatCrunch, If we didn't, if we only had our two endpoints, then we would need to subtract these two and divide by 2. But since we know where the middle is, right, p hat is in the middle, I can just subtract, and I'm not going to pull my calculator over for you to see, but I'll use my sample proportion. It was the 640. And actually, I could see what this should be just by knowing what the difference is between the midpoint and this upper endpoint. That's just going to be adding 0.037. So plus or minus 0.037. So there are the 3 different formats that we've talked about in class. Then we want to interpret our confidence interval. So there's kind of a cookie cutter interpretation that you can use. I personally like to use the plural first person. That's something that's commonly done in the math world. So I would say we are 99% confident, and that 99%, I'm going to move this paper out of the way. That 99% comes directly from just what was it that you were asked to find. So we are 99% confident that the proportion of, and then I'm going to come back up here to where I have my population. I'm going to write that entire thing. And yes, I know, sometimes that ends up being a lot of words, but just go ahead and do it. So we're 99% confident that the proportion of all prospective home buyers in the Southeast United States so let me So here's my, basically my context of the problem. And that came directly from what we identified as the population. If you just say we are 99% confident that the proportion of the population, or that the population proportion is between these two numbers, I will not give you credit for mentioning the context here. So 99% confident that prospective home buyers in the Southeast United States is somewhere between, and then we need our two numbers from our confidence interval. So somewhere between 0.603 and 0.677. And of course, those two numbers are just straight from StatCrunch. So there's finding a confidence interval and then also interpreting it. There's some more videos in Brightspace if you want to see some more examples worked out. You can also ask after class or during student hours.